the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we do want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We have opened up access to our Discord server for patrons, and Taylor is leading
a new reading group.
We're on our second reading group, but all of the previous ones are up on Patreon. And so we're giving something back to patrons now, a little bit more than we had in the past. So just consider that if you're enjoying the show and want to support the work that we're doing.
Yeah, we'll have our second meeting of the reading group next Sunday. We're doing Laurel's non-standard philosophy, access to that.
Well, this is going to be out. This is going to be out way later than by the time
this is out.
So you might not even.
That's true, but we'll probably still be doing that book when you hear this, and there'll be more of the recordings, as Coop said, on Patreon. So yes, hit that, smash that donate button, come join us, and we actually had a nice group. We had about 15 people.
Nice, that's not bad.
So anyway, we're back into Simondon.
So we're going to be taking a look. Is this, you might have to help me with what we read because I was confused by the table of contents.
No, I understand.
It was chapter 2?
Yes. So this is chapter 2 of part 1 and chapter 1 of part 2. Titles is Evolution of Technical Reality, Element, Individual, Ensemble. And then the other chapter is the 2 fundamental modes of relation between man and the technical given. Because I know that our first, for the listeners who are just jumping in, we've already done one installment where we covered the intro and chapter 1 of part 1. So we're just kind of like, I know we've mutilated the book a little bit, but we didn't want to like try to cover too much material and then not do justice to a lot of it, right? I mean, that's basically why we've done odd carvings. But it is interesting to be doing Simondon and his book on the mode of existence of technical objects, because we are really getting into the machinic unconscious. And the machinic conscious.
Very interesting. Yeah, we do have. I'll be sure to link the original episode from the book in the show notes. I thought it might be good again to give. I'm even curious about this because I didn't do this much homework on just like filling in as much as you can. Like, what is like explain Simondon to me, just in the sense of what is his, because he's looking at what would basically be conceived of kind of, I don't even know, like there's mechanical physics is involved. He's doing lab work, etc. Because I think that might provide some good ground and I am punning by using ground because that's a topic that I kind of want to open up with once we get into the actual text itself. But
yeah, so Simondon is interesting, right? He is one of the thinkers in that post-World War II lineage, except he's not obviously as prominent or considered, except through Deleuze, right? Deleuze is the one that kind of kept his name alive, I would say, to a certain extent, because the two books that he does publish come out of the two dissertations that he had to do, and he published in 58. So this is the secondary, if you want to call it that, dissertation, published in 1958. And the other of which I translated, right? We've talked about it a little bit, individuation in light of forms of, in light of the notions of form and information.
We did an episode on something from
we've covered that. I know that we talked to Craig and Adam over at Acid Horizon about it. I think Will was there. I don't remember. In any case, so this is the only thing he technically publishes in his life. And this is maybe another one of the reasons why, besides, so he was publishing articles and essays in some journals. That is true. But in terms of books, these are the two that he published. And a lot of the work that he was doing as a teacher, his courses have come out. And so there's been a kind of a resurgence in interest in Simondon. And I think I've told you the story that Laruelle was the one who had a hand in making sure that part of his primary dissertation, the one I just mentioned, lovingly call it Ilfi, was published in the year of his death in 89. It originally been sort of lopped off part of it. It was published as a standalone book in 64, the one that Deleuze refers to. It only focused on the physical and biological portions and cut out the stuff on what he calls the psychical and the and the collective. So there's a weird publication, even in the books that did make it, there's a weird publication history that it wasn't until, I believe, until 2005 that you had finally in one book, in one volume in French, the entire primary dissertation. So even there, the two books that he published, one was already mutilated a little bit. But Deleuze does refer to both of these works. I believe in Anti-Oedipus, he makes a passing reference to this book that we're talking about, which makes sense because of its covering of technical objects, machines, etc. And I guess that you asked me, what's the deal with Simondon? Yes, he did. A lot of the pictures you find on Google, you see him in like a lab coat. He did teach, but he taught at like a polytechnic school. And that word is perhaps in America or just in English, we might think of polytechnic schools as in France. They're a little bit more. They're not just hands-on for engineers. They also do involve, obviously, the arts like they do in America. But he was also covering, like, for example, I think I've told you about his book, The Course on Perception, that he did in 64, 65. I've translated that. That's forthcoming through Minnesota Press, hopefully maybe later this year. In any case, so like the history, his book on, or his course on perception is interesting because it not only covers sort of perception in the Western philosophical tradition, but also gets into stuff that is cutting edge at the time, I would say, or at least of interest in 58 at the time, and 64 for the course. Theories like Gestalt theory, right? He this is why you wanted to start with ground, for example. That's one of the fundamental terms, figure ground relationships. He looks at those. He's also in the 50s very much involved with the coterie of intellectuals forming around Norbert Wiener and the birth of what will be called cybernetics, which he makes a passing reference to in, I think, one of the chapters we read. But he was very much involved with that group of thinkers. And so he is, to a certain extent, this is why I think this is another reason why I think, to a certain extent, not just due to the publications, but he is approaching philosophy in a very interesting way, in a way that I think that might put him in the camp more of a scientist, even though that is we could call him that. I think he's kind of a technician in the sense in which you mentioned his lab work, the stuff that he was doing and experimenting. Yeah, I think he would be a technician, somewhat of an engineer, but his philosophy is interesting because it would be, I think, it would both span what we might think of as philosophy of science, but go well beyond that in a strict sense in which we see it in the Anglo tradition. It very much is a interesting marriage of science and philosophy, and he does try to keep a philosophical perspective on a lot of these things. But I do think that his subject matter and his place in the academia, right? Not at like the École Normale or at the Sorbonne or the Collège de France. He's kind of, in an interesting way, situated in the periphery of the philosophical disciplines because of that. He's a very interesting thinker. I think he's definitely worth reading, and I'm glad that more of his work is coming out. If you remember, and this will cap off what I'm saying. If you remember when we last had Rocco Gangle on, and this is one of the courses I haven't gotten to read, but he was very interested in, and I think it came out maybe in 2023, on imagination and invention. And I think that course, in the little bit that I've read in his discussion of magic, I think comes out of some of this preliminary work, because we saw he's starting to develop an interesting way in which to think what he calls technics and technical investigations in a way that is not only opposed to magic, but also preserves a little bit of that magical essence that we might think to be gone in, at least again, in academic classic, rational philosophical investigations. So I think too, there will be some of the work we've done looking at thinkers like Mose and his book on magic will probably come in handy. But I'll leave it there. I didn't necessarily, I was just kind of giving more or less a biographical, we'll let the concepts speak for themselves when we dive into them.
Because yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, like I get the sense of like this is. I mean, you can really see the through line to Deleuze and like so clearly, and so much of this. And honestly, for me, like it having a more, I'll pun again on grounded sort of approach to looking at these kind of. I mean, ultimately, like what he's talking about is flows of energy, flows of information, reciprocal data, relationships between different milieus and human versus machine versus tool and environment, and kind of all of those sort of feedback loops and
even flows of knowledge, as we see when he goes into the encyclopedia stuff.
Forces, I suppose, objects, a lot of that's there. He's tapping into, even though he doesn't name Spinoza, I feel like he mentioned some like periods of rest, etc., that got me thinking about Spinoza. And I think Spinoza came up a little bit in the last episode we did on this work itself. He directly references Freud, which I don't want to jump into this quote yet, but I will once I kind of wrap up this kind of general discussion of just kind of some of the resonances that you see present, because he even goes into negativity, which sort of is a veiled critique of dialectic, I think, right? Or does he?
He will critique dialectics, and you're right. I noted that in our reading where he says, I think it's in this chapter 2 that we read.
Specifically, while you're looking, it's
Yeah.
really the negative. He's kind of talking about the negative as the driver of the mode of existence of technical objects. Maybe, I don't know.
He says the different aspects of the technical being's individualization constitute the center of an evolution which proceeds via successive stages, but which is not dialectical in the proper sense of the term, because in regard to it, negativity does not play the role of an engine of progress. And I think that this comes out of something that was already hinted at in the first chapter that we covered in the other episode, which was basically when he's talking about the concretization of individuals, right? As technical individuals become more concrete, in this sense of evolution that he's talking about. I think for him, negativity is not the motor. He will have more to say about this in probably later in the book, but also in, as I mentioned, Ilfie, the other dissertation. He proposes a term called transduction. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that if this comes up. I don't want to sidetrack us going into that too much, but I know that when I first started getting into Simondon on my erstwhile blog, my former blog, I wrote up a short list of some of the words, some of the terms and concepts he uses. Let me just see if I did have transduction in there. I quoted from another book, which is called Transductions by Adrian McKenzie. And the quote there I pulled says, for the process of transduction to occur, there must be some disparity, discontinuity, or mismatch within a domain, two different forms or potentials whose disparity can be modulated. Transduction is a process whereby a disparity or a difference, note to Liz, is topologically and temporally restructured across some interface. It mediates different organizations of energy. And then I pulled from one of his definitions, which I won't read, but he tries to argue that the one thing he says, unlike the dialectic, transduction does not presuppose the existence of a previous time period to act as a framework in which the genesis unfolds, time itself being the solution and dimension of the discovered systematic. Time comes from the pre-individual, just like the other dimensions that determine individuation. So he is thinking, and I think that you're right to bring in Spinoza, obviously. That Spinoza and Nietzsche in particular are the two of the thinkers Deleuze will try to bring to bear to combat the Hegelian menace, so to speak. But in any case.
So he also, in addition to that, he directly references Freud, like I mentioned a moment ago. I'll go ahead and read this quote. Freud analyzed the influence of ground on forms of psychic life by interpreting this influence as one of hidden forms on explicit forms, hence the notion of repression. So I just thought that was it is this concept of ground. I mean, where do we place this relative to like milieu or?
This is a good question.
Or even like there's questions of virtual and actual and so forth too that I think are wrapped up a little bit in terms of ground.
We can obviously take ground in a very abstract sense, but in a concrete sense, what the Gestalt theorists, the Gestalt school of psychology was wanting to do with figuring ground, and where Simondon looks very concretely at, for example, these different forms of illusions that involve experimenting with actual subjects. There's a way in which figure and ground are two elements that Gestalt theory uses to try to understand all kinds of different, I don't want to say individuations in the Simondonian sense, but we could use that term. For example, in theories of camouflage, ground and figure come into play very, very well. Any figure is just basically anything that can kind of stand out in relief, right, and sort of take on a dimension of perceptibility. The ground is that from which it distinguishes itself, right? Deleuze tries to do something very interesting with this, with like the dark precursor, which is a notion he did drop later, but there's a sense in which like for him, the example he uses like there's a dark precursor to the lightning, right? And so there's a way in which the dark precursor is almost the ground from which the lightning stands out as a figure, if you wanted to like use those terms. Deleuze doesn't really interested in Gestalt theory, although Simondon very much is. And but you can see these in all kinds of illusions. The way in which, for example, you've seen those paintings where it's like if you look at it one way, it's an old lady. If you look at it another way, that is a type of illusion, if you want to call it that, where figure and ground are shifting. Where from one perspective, there's a ground like the white and black. Usually it's white and black. There's the white background, if you want to use it that way, allows for the black contour to figure as a certain image. But then, and experiments on this are very interesting. Simondon's going through all of these in the course on perception. Then the black color becomes ground and a white figure stands out. So even on that very basic level, we can then apply, I think, figure ground in a way, or even understand ground in a more abstract philosophical way. Influence of ground on forms. Yeah, I mean, this is going back to your quote that you read from Simondon. Freud analyzed the influence of ground, or of the ground. On forms. Yeah, I suppose there's a way in which perhaps we could think of the unconscious as ground, and then what would that help us to do? Perhaps then, again, using Gestalt theory terms, symptom formations, or if we want to stick with this topographical model, or not even topographical, but the dynamic model, then consciousness allows itself in fleeting moments to be figured on this background. I'm not so convinced that that's very helpful, but it sort of makes sense.
I may do this a few times throughout the episode, but here's one where I was thinking. I mean, since you mentioned camouflage, I was thinking about, for example, in Dune, the Fremen, their way that they walk without rhythm, which is a type of camouflage against predation, right? They're trying to mimic the rhythms of the open desert, for example, so for a survival purpose.
They're mimicking the strata, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, right? They're mimicking the strata. But you're right. The desert is the ground, and walking without rhythm is trying to mimic the natural movements of the desert, whatever that may be.
The flows, right?
The flows of the wind on the whatever natural subterranean activity is going on, whether by the worms themselves or even the fauna, like the Muad'Dib mouse. And its tracks that it makes. So moving without rhythm is in order to sort of stick as close to the ground as possible without taking on the relief of a figure, if that makes sense, right? Because that's what gets you in trouble,
right? Yeah, because that's perceptibility, which you referred to, right? Okay, good. But I don't know. I just think that I think just the pared down relationship between the Fremen and Arrakis in particular, like, exemplifies so many of these kind of a lot of the kind of sort of the arguments can really be worked through at that level, because those are very distilled examples, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are some other ones that I don't know if I want to necessarily get into. I think I spoke of them a bit last time.
The other, he extends camouflage to the then new technology, or somewhat new technology, of sonar and jamming, right? So there's a way in which jamming, he goes through different types of jamming, but one of the ways that jamming would work. And now we're on the level figure ground of information theory, right? And signals and these other things. But there's a way in which, for example, the example he gives, and this takes us a little bit outside of sonar and jamming, but he says, okay, so if you took a text and slightly and say took a page and had another page with the same text and slightly superposed it, that would jam better than the same amount of words but in a different order or different words. There's a way in which there's almost an interesting jamming effect of, again, mimicry in a different sense. Now we're sort of mimicking the figure and superposing the figure onto it and trying to map that in a way that like two waves canceling out, if you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, I was thinking too along those lines, like something like the Fremen thumper, which they place in the ground to create the vibrations which attract the worm. That's a different type of, right? Obviously, that's not camouflage per se. That might be more related to some of the other, like the transportation discussion, because he talks about trains in particular, and then automobiles, and then even there's the prop engine airplanes versus jet engine airplanes. That's a little bit later on in the discussion, but it did get me thinking. That's kind of an interesting little bridge, but also I think even at a base level, it's like the communication that is happening in relation to the environment, right? Because like the thumper is communicating something in its vibrations, you know, at its base is not that different from like audio communication, right? Because sound waves or vibrations that are carried through the atmosphere. This is like, and even your sonar example, or maybe not sonar, but maybe it is sonar, like on a submarine, for example, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Kind of similar process at play where those vibrations are communicating something.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he starts this chapter talking about what he calls hypertely, if we want to say it that way, which would be, I think his gloss on it is an exaggerated degree of specialization that becomes maladapted to even slight changes in the conditions of its utilization or fabrication. So hyper obviously is like, we can think of it. Usually, I mean, it's related to like super, but it's to an exaggerated degree, to a heightened degree. The telos, the end for which it is formed. It's a strange word, but it's not all that different. So yeah, he starts with this notion of hyper specialization, and it's interesting because he had just left off talking about concretization, and so we can extend this by saying, we extend the conversation we had in the first episode by saying that there's something interesting going on where just because a technical object is becoming more concrete doesn't mean it is merely becoming more and more specialized to very specific types of degrees. One of the examples he gives is a certain type of tire that might be good in cold weather wouldn't necessarily be useful in warm weather. And so there is a sense in which concretization isn't absolutely opposed to what we might think of as generic, because I don't want to say abstract.
Yeah.
Right? We might come up with a concrete abstract opposition that doesn't quite fit what Simondon is talking about. And so by hyper specializing, that doesn't necessarily mean we become more concrete. It actually means we have limited ourselves. And here we're talking about technical objects, because he mentions like certain jets.
Right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking about too.
You're not going to be able to land, or at least not well, a jet in the kind of countryside where they have very rudimentary types of landing strips. Whereas you mentioned other kinds of planes. We can think about the planes used to.
Yeah, like a plane with a prop would be, plus the altitude thing he brings up as well. Like a jet engine is better suited to traveling at higher elevations or
course.
altitudes rather, versus a prop plane would be more suited to traveling at lower elevations.
So there's an interesting way in which he is using terms outside of where we normally find them, like terms like evolution. We normally think about that on the biological stratum. He's thinking about the evolution of technical objects. And so it already has it always already has a kind of social network in which it's conceived, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think that's why the next chapter, the first chapter of part 2, we start to see him discussing, we can almost say in a Deleuzian way, he doesn't put it this way, but we could think of it as a Deleuzian way, that like the social and technical framework around a society and a culture determine the type of alienation that comes about of it. And I think that's why he said that there's no sense in a humanism that would be valid for all times. There are humanisms that arise and tackle the problems that are posed in a certain framework, in a certain context, based on the social, technical, etc. type of conditions. So I found that very interesting, especially since the trend, obviously leading up more in the 60s with like Lacan, Althusser, Foucault, just to name a few, is going to be putting an emphasis on anti-humanism. I think it's interesting that Simondon wants to keep this notion of a humanism that would not be trans-historical, but would be very concretely historical and therefore ephemeral, right? It wouldn't be. So he's not talking about, a kind of universality of human rights or anything like that. That kind of humanism. He's very much specifically like thinking of an embedded type of humanism that would be provisional and changing.
So sort of this below quote I've sort of cobbled together about man as a tool bearer, and then ellipses, he's oriented both towards the relation with elements and towards the relation with ensembles, which I add on, that kind of sounds like to me like the social and psychical world, which would link back to Freud, right? Right. Yeah. Man's relationship to both, like in terms of repression, right? Because we have both social and psychic repression.
Yes, this discussion, he wants to make, he sees 3 levels in Technics, right? So we have technical elements, which he thinks are the ones that determine a society's or a culture's capabilities, right? He talks about, I think he mentions like the swords. Was it swords? There's a certain steel coming from Toledo, for example, and he situates it within the framework. Here we go, page 73. Technicity is the degree of the object's concretization. During the period of wood foundries, it was this concretization that gave Toledo's blades their value and prestige, and more recently led to the quality of Saint Etienne's steel. I suppose that's a town in France. But he goes on to say that like this is a whole matrix. There's a whole matrix of things that go into determining the quality, the technical quality of certain individuals. And I guess that's the third. So in between elements on the low end, if you want to take it that way, and ensembles, right, whole aggregates, which would include like the steel foundry itself, along with whatever other means of transport to bring the materials, or we could think of the power generated by different mills, etc. It's the whole network is the ensemble. In the middle is the technical individual, which we might think of as, in this case, he mentioned the blades, like the actual sword produced. I know different. It is interesting to think about the history of Technics from the angle of military assemblages. Deleuze and Guattari do this in towards the end of A Thousand Plateaus. but we could think about those different type of assemblages in this matrix of element, individual, ensemble, right?
Yeah. I mean, even going back to Virilio's War in Cinema, right? There's
Right.
a kind
Yes.
of definitely that's like in conversation. That'd be, oh, I mean, I just had that idea. That's really good.
No, that
Look
would
at
be
those, look at that, and this here would be.
To revisit Virilio's War in Cinema, because one of his driving theses throughout the book, which we covered, is this interesting way in which cinema is part and parcel of the war effort, the whole technological ensemble at play, driving it, but also being driven by it in the different types of innovations that come about. In the course on perception, Simondon himself mentions in the First World War, there was a way in which cinematography and photography, which were becoming more developed in the early 20th century, there was a way in which that was linked to aviation, because at the time aviation too was in its infancy, and there was a kind of effort to try and make it so that aviation was not used for aerial battles and bombings and other types of directly combative means, but merely for reconnaissance. That obviously didn't happen, because we do know that there were some of the first firefights, right, in history were during the First World War. But that itself kind of extends part of Virilio's interest in seeing this ramp up of warfare and cinema at the same time in the early 20th century. It's very fascinating.
I don't know where to go necessarily from here that would flow very well, but I have this little bit about body without organs, but even looking at the way that, because the example I gave earlier with the thumper does certainly call back the spider and the spider web as a body without organs, in the sense of the vibrations are what alert the spider to its prey, which is a very similar methodology for predation that the worms on Arrakis use, right? So I don't know if you want to talk about body without organs at this point, or if we should smooth something else in here. But
well, if you want to read some of this, I'm not opposed to it.
Sure. Let me. Here we go. In reality, there exists a great kinship between life and thought. Within a living organism, all living matter cooperates in life. It is not only the most apparent or the clearest structures that have the initiative of life in the body, blood, lymph nodes, and conjunctive tissues partake in life. An individual is not made up of a collection of organs combined with one another into systems. An individual is made up of that which is neither organ nor structure of living matter, insofar as it constitutes an associated milieu for the organs. Living matter is the ground of the organs. It is what allows them to relate to each other and become an organism. It is what maintains the fundamental thermal and chemical equilibriums upon which the organs deliver brisk but limited variations. The organs participate in the body, which is interesting if you look at that from the perspective of like the individuated subject kind of is a sort of organ for whatever, right? And it's part of this greater, like the body of the earth, etc., the cosmos, if you want to abstract out that far.
Yeah. I was trying to find where
the wasp and the orchid too, right? It's like,
yes,
it's an extent, the wasp is an extension of the reproductive organs in a sense.
I mean, this is one of the ways he tries to define the technical individual is, or the technical object, sorry, as the meeting point between two milieus, or as he'll say, two worlds act upon each other. And the example here he's given is a motor or an engine, but he is thinking in general that the technical object allows two worlds to interact upon each other. It is interesting, though, mentioning the wasp and the orchid. It's like for Deleuze and Guattari, there is this interesting way of, there's a surplus value of code. How does that come about, right? For them, they want to forego any sort of notion of resemblance. That's precisely begging the question: how is it? What is the technics at play that allows these two worlds that are absolutely without any parallels to affect one another and interact? And so, leaving that aside, because that's a rhetorical question that we can't answer immediately, only as way of an example of how Simondon himself is thinking the technical object. And so here, with your quote, it is interesting that one of the notions that is interesting, instead of jumping right at the body-led organs, but one of the notions that is interesting and that Deleuze and Guattari too will seize upon is the notion of an associated or annexed milieu. I think that's Deleuze and Guattari's language of an annexed milieu, although they will keep Simondon's terminology. But this notion of an associated milieu, which I did find, this is early in this chapter 2, page 59. We can therefore affirm that the individualization of technical beings is the condition of technical progress. This individualization is made possible by the recurrence of causality within a milieu that the technical object creates around itself and that conditions it just as it is conditioned by it. This simultaneously technical and natural milieu can be called an associated milieu. It is that through which the technical object conditions itself in its functioning. This milieu is not fabricated, or at least not fabricated in its totality. It is a certain regime of natural elements surrounding the technical being linked to a certain regime of elements that constitute the technical being. And then he gives this example of this interesting engine whereby the problem that was trying to be solved was how to ramp up this engine's output without it overheating. And so he talks about this kind of way in which the associated milieu that is that the technical that is required, so to speak, to solve the problem is this way of layering oil and water. I won't give the full description. That's on page 59, and I think it continues through 60.
Yeah, but this was super interesting. The relationship. I mean, I think really like the kind of issue at stake, or the stakes are like an entropy,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, and here's like the harnessing of the negative in a sense, in a way, maybe that, I don't know, or the harnessing, because it's something about the pressure generated by the turning of the motor or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what the specific terminology he's going for, but it's something about that sort of heats up maybe the fluid, the oil and the water mixture, and that kind of like creates a pressure that pushes back on something else that kind of
and allows the water to cool. Yeah, it is a kind of interest. And I wonder if this type of machine or technical ensemble, really is what we should say, is still extant, is still around. But we can probably apply this to other means. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and one of the reasons why Simondon is a philosopher and he is thinking on the transcendental level, is because he's arguing that the associated milieu, if that's what allows us to understand the individualization of the technical object, we have to think about how, and I'm trying to find exactly, I found your Freud quote, that's on 61. And he talks about the virtual and the actual on that page too, which is really fascinating. I was trying to find exactly where he says it, but basically argues that the technical object is its own conditions of possibility, right? So he's understanding invention in a way that is not just a play on the old adage of necessity is the mother of invention. He's kind of thinking more along the lines that, in a Deleuzian sense, or at least I think there's a relationship there between a problem to be solved and the solution of the problem, it lies precisely within the invention. So that to a certain degree, there's a way in which makes its own conditions of possibility possible, right? Or it is its own condition of possibility. There's a way in which there's a kind of bootstrapping going on in the technical object.
Okay, so I think I brought this up the last time we spoke about this. And this might have more to do with moves towards concretization, but I was thinking of two things. One, the way that a hybrid car engine, right? What it does is it harnesses the wasted energy from the braking process, the decelerative process it's harnessing that to charge the electrical aspect of the hybrid engine, the electric motor. So there's that I was thinking of, but I was also thinking of something like, similarly, the pumping action in the Fremen still suit is generated by the heel landing on like whenever the heel strikes the ground, that creates the pumping action. So it's like this, I guess, but it has to do, right? It's speed. It's like rest versus speed versus like acceleration, all tangled up in one another relative to, I don't know if the terminology gets confusing, so I won't even try to get into whether that's the technical object or yada yada, but I don't know. I just thought that those were two kind of interesting examples that might have some purchase in this whole discussion of, which going back to like his example, right? Because the viscosity, the heat, the relationship between temperature and how that provides the pressure, which pushes back on, etc. Right? Because you typically think, right, like heat is often a byproduct of metabolism broadly. We could even say, perhaps, I don't know, that might be provisional, but
no. I'm just taking it in and
because I'm thinking about these ways that wasted energy or not is incorporated into the positive functioning of the machine. And I don't know if that goes into the bootstrapping example necessarily, but I just find something super fascinating about that, especially with respect to his discussions of negativity as well, because these are kind of negative aspects that are kind of like, there is like this Aufhebung, there is this sublation of these waste, but maybe the judgment of calling something waste in itself is like a presupposition that's maybe doesn't check out, right? Like to consider the negative loss of energy whenever something's decelerating, right? Because a car, it's in motion until it hits another object that slows it down, right? And the brake pads are that object that's applying pressure. So it's like it's not the most efficient without the hybrid engine that's capturing that lost energy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That whenever you're adding in the hybrid, then that's really moving towards the concretization, because you're harnessing the kind of quote unquote negative. We'll say what negative in scare quotes, the loss, the entropy, and like reasserting that same way that the still suit uses the natural motion, the negative, like the depression of whenever you're traveling by walking, whether that be in the desert or wherever, right? It's like your contact, the friction between the foot or the wheel or whatever is traveling on the surface. If that was smoother, in the sense of like if you had walking versus having on roller skates in the context of the heel providing the pumping action to power the still suit. Do you know what I'm saying? Or I don't know if you're seeing that the analog I'm drawing between the braking process on a hybrid engine and the pumping action provided, because it's like the contact with the ground is what's slowing you down in a sense when you're walking, although that contact has a positive, right? Because if you're going too fast, right, you can't stop, you fall down, etc. But
right,
it's the harnessing of that, that kind of quote unquote waste or that quote unquote negative that's just going into, you know what I mean? I don't know. I think that's just interesting.
If we go back to the quote on 71 about negativity, which I read a snippet of, but I didn't give the whole paragraph. While he does say negativity does not play the role of an engine of progress, which is why it's not dialectical in the quote unquote proper sense of the term. He goes on to say, in the technical world, negativity is a lack of individuation and incomplete junction of the natural world and the technical world. This negativity is not the engine of process. It is rather the engine of transformation. It incites man to seek new, more satisfactory solutions than he possesses. But, and here's the but, right? So not progress, but transformation. That's how he sees negativity. But he says, this desire for change, however, does not happen directly within the technical being. It happens within man as a venturing user, which makes sense and obvious from what he just said. But the last thing he says, this change, moreover, must not be confused with progress. A change that is too abrupt is contrary to technical progress because it prevents the transmission in the form of technical elements of what an age has acquired to the one that follows. And I bet he would have a lot to say about, that being still a problem, right? Today.
Right. Like the development of AI, whenever the social
Sure.
systems haven't progressed far enough to like alleviate the destructive capacity, the technological development at too great a speed is a threat to the very survival of the social as it stands.
Yeah, I agree with that. And part of that too is we have seen other countries. I know ours is absolutely shit at legislating anything. And I'm not saying that this is the only measure of and way of dealing with it, but we can think about laws in place surrounding like the deep fake revenge porn. That's just one avatar of the kind of thing to come out of the proliferation of AI. Not the only one, though, obviously. And I know when we had a discussion with Charles Duvall and Dan Smith, we were trying to be more optimistic, but optimism is in short supply these days, I know. In any case, it's interesting, though, this difference between progress and transformation. And how for him there is a sense, kind of like your analogy of obviously going too fast, right? There is a sense in which transformation for transformation's sake for Simondon would in fact be counter to progress, because progress would, I think, in his definition, then involve a way in which one age is able to carry over to the next some of the fruits of the quote unquote technical elements, right? Okay, let's see. Do you want to talk a little bit about the next chapter? I know we've only kind of scratched the surface of the evolution of technical reality, but I wondered if you wanted to maybe if we could say a few words about chapter 1 of part 2. I mentioned a little bit about the humanism stuff. I do think some of this stuff is interesting. Like, for example, he starts with a kind of historical overview and mentions that, there's a sense in which technics in the ancient world was restricted in its noble, positive sense to agriculture and animal husbandry. Those were kind of like the noble pursuits. It is interesting just thinking about how that also coincides with the way that menial labor was carried out by slaves. And he kind of mentions that as slavery begins to become obsolete, we start to see the technical trades in the more mechanical sense, right? The more menial labor sense take on a different status, even to the point of reversing the lens and sort of making things like farming and ranching, for example, as we might say in America, seem, if not outdated, somewhat of a less socially stellar role. It all depends on if you're running for office or not, right? Because the farmers are they feed the people and all that. but I think that this also goes to the opposition he comes at later in the chapter, which he said elsewhere, and which is not new to him, about this difference between the values associated with the countryside and the city. Although for Simondon, he displaces that question of values, which is just a bit of social snobbery, to this difference between, and I don't know how much that would be true today, but this difference between, in the countryside, life there is tied to a region. It's about simultaneity, whereas living in the city, it's more of a function of time and more of a question of succession. I'm trying to look, and I may, if I can find that, I'll bring it back up, and I may have even like reversed it. But in any case, I do think it's interesting he brings up Socrates, as I just want to mention in particular. Socrates is very interesting when he goes, say, to like the shipbuilders, or he goes and questions the master of trades. He comes to the realization that they can't formulate in language and speech the mastery that they have. And this goes to the heart of what Simondon talks about. For example, he gives the example of like there's the difference between the apprentice and the engineer, but even more so on page 107, he brings up E.T.A. Hoffman's story called The Mines of Falun. And it's like, he gets to the heart of this interesting thing where what Socrates realizes is these masters of different crafts and trades, they don't have knowledge per se. They have what we might call savoir-faire. They have a knack, right? They have a know-how that doesn't necessarily translate into symbolically, informationally transmissible knowledge. So this is why he calls it a kind of intuition. And he even gets into this notion of initiation and instinct, right? That there is almost like, and again, I don't know if you remember E.T.A. Hoffman's name. He's the one that Freud looks at in The Uncanny, with the story about the mannequin or the doll or whatever. And in any case, there's a sense in which this discussion of initiation, there's a certain magic in this test, which is an act through which the child becomes a man by using all his strength pushed to its extreme limit for the first time. But in any case, it seems like for Simondon that while this is definitely true of how certain individuals, whether by culture or by this initiation, etc., are sort of born for a certain type of activity, like in the tale of Hoffman's tale, like the true miner is like at home in the mine and has a certain almost supernatural connection with it that warns him, whereas whoever is taking up mining, say, to like just make a living, they are kind of like outsiders and they violate the domain, which is again why he's bringing up magic. But I think that the one thing and this is why he distinguished between major and minor. The minor, and here in a different sense, minor not in the sense of being in a mine, but as opposed to major, there's a sense in which like this knack, if you will, this instinct can't necessarily be taught. It has to be done almost in a sense of like training and being raised to do something, right? Whether it's hereditary or not. And this is why he distinguishes it from the major mode of what he calls encyclopedism. I wonder, just off the top of my head, and I'm going to pause to let you jump in, I wonder when Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia comes out. What's the year? It was edited by Diderot between 1751 and 1772. So I think this is why he's thinking of it leading up to the French Revolution, right? He makes a fairly political reading of this when he says, I'm just reading a little bit from 110 to 111. Of course, what is taught here is high-level knowledge, but despite this, it is meant for all. the cost of the book alone limits the possible purchases, right? He's talking about this is a universally acquirable knowledge, not something that's merely left to the guilds or to initiation rituals. And then he goes on to say, this consistent and objective universality, which supposes an internal resonance of this technical world, requires that the book be open to all and that it constitute a material and intellectual universality, a block of available and open technical knowledge. And then he goes on, a society of autodidacts, this is great, cannot accept tutelage and the status of spiritual minority. It aspires to govern itself on its own and to manage itself. It is principally in this sense and through its technological power that the encyclopedia brought about a new force and a new social dynamic. The causal circularity of encyclopedic knowledge excludes the moral and political heteronomy of the monarchy. So I just thought that was cool that it did lead up to, I guess it was like the prior, if you want to think about it this way, it's like the generation before the French Revolution.
Setting the ground and the conditions of possibility for the revolution.
It definitely correlated with that spirit, right? I mean, whether or not, I think it was one of the conditions of possibility. Yes, I do. I think that it helped to make more inevitable the revolution, let's say.
Right.
And I think that was cool. It's very interesting when Simondon, as you see him reflecting on what you think is merely a technical or intellectual, even when he starts describing these social editions, it's interesting when he makes a directly political point that is very valuable. And again, it would be interesting to think about what Simondon would have to say about things like Wikipedia. And I don't even mean the Wikipedia. I mean just the concept of something like Wikipedia. I do think that it would fall in line with some of his analyses. For example, what I said about every age kind of gets the humanism it deserves, to put it in a Deleuzian way.
It's funny because Wikipedia always gets shit on upon, and I've mentioned this multiple times in prior episodes. It's been a while, but like it always gets shit on by not its accuracy because it can be the democratized ability to edit the entries. But statistically speaking, by like the raw numbers, it's the most accurate encyclopedia we've ever had, which is just a funny kind of dialectical.
Well, this is why, it's interesting. And he goes through like 3 different ages of the encyclopedia. And he sees it first in the Renaissance, obviously with the printing press, the move from like reading the Bible in Latin back to the original sources. And also you see the first translations in vernacular around this time. So there's a movement. So the alienation that was going on there for Simondon had to do with religion. And he makes an interesting point where he's like, look, when Christianity first came about, it was liberatory. It was against whether it be the Roman Empire or whatnot, right? It had a dynamic that was definitely opposed to the powers that be. Fast forward 1,000+ years later, though, it's obviously become the dominant religion and if not the source, at least the medium and vehicle through which so many of the political conflicts between nations surrounding sovereignty, etc., not to mention the Crusades and that kind of thing, it definitely became the oppressor, right? So this first movement is against a kind of sociocultural, religious alienation. And then he sees, in the Enlightenment, there's another movement. There's a different problem of alienation. And then obviously in the 20th, you see that the form of alienation becomes different. Obviously in the 21st, with some of the things we've talked about, there are new forms of alienation. Obviously, Wikipedia could be a case in point here as a 4th stage in his technical encyclopedism, because yes, now the encyclopedias aren't merely being done by quote unquote intellectuals, academicians, even though if some of them participated in it, it's theoretically, again, conceptually, because I'm not thinking of Wikipedia in its actual dimensions, because that has its own problems. But the concept of Wikipedia, right? That concept of the open source encyclopedia would have its own advantages and drawbacks, right? It would have its own problems to face. But yeah, I guess that would be. I mean, that's the question of this progress and why each age kind of has the humanism it deserves, right? There would obviously be a different humanism today required than the one that Simondon is discussing in the late 50s, although it wouldn't necessarily be absolutely different, right? I mean, even some of the things he's saying about television versus radio and the different types of ways in which those forms of media can become liberatory, if not like beneficial for society. We still have some of that today. That it's only slightly shifted to things like, questions of streaming, or on the underside, questions of torrenting and like quote unquote illegally downloading media, right? So
It's also a question interesting, like the relationship to authority, or in the context of knowledge relative to religion and etc. Because right now with Wikipedia, right, it diminishes the power, opens up the flows of information relative to monks or scribes developing an encyclopedia, or religious knowledge for that matter, right? Because religious information is bottled up in the flows of the transmission of the priests, etc. Versus once the Protestant Reformation comes, that deterritorializes the flows, in which there's obviously the reciprocal reterritorialization back into this authority, but at a different stage of distribution, let's say.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And again, that.
But very interestingly, right, this kind of the parallels between the cultural and the technical object developments are so, like, they flow in the similar directions, right? Because he talks about as well the way that certain energy flows, or energy sources rather, right? Because we start out with something like,
This is on page 70 and 71. I think right where he ends by saying there is no intrinsic relation between nuclear energy and energy derived from the photoelectric effect.
That's getting to what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The last sentence, I just want to read: the relation that existed between electrical energy and energy derived from the combustion of gasoline exists once more between nuclear energy and photoelectric energy, perhaps with a more accentuated difference. I think that's, and obviously you could expand that to different ways of harnessing energy, and the new context, obviously, of the devastation of the climate, right? I mean, I think that adds a different dimension to this discussion, but it is interesting.
It's interesting the way, like, the degrees of freedom present in something like, because what he talks about, obviously, like nuclear energy, like we haven't figured out a way to make that as dynamic. It goes back to his notion of his discussion of the train versus the car, right? Because I suppose they're both operating on a thermodynamic sort of model of energy, but the vehicle has an auxiliary electrical dimension to it. But also the contrast between the movement, because the train must stay on its tracks. It requires a certain amount of inertia, etc., versus the automobile is more deterritorialized in terms of its movements. It can follow its roads. It can vary from its path or its trajectory, what have you.
Yeah, and to go back to your point about the technical and the social being, as he says, they're synchronized but not identical, but
Yeah.
they parallel to a certain degree. Where he says the development of thermodynamics went hand in hand with railway transportation, not simply with the transportation of coal, but of passengers. On the contrary, the development of electrotechnics went hand in hand with the development of automotive transport. The automobile, albeit thermodynamic in principle, uses electric energy as an essential auxiliary, in particular for ignition. And then he says industrial decentralization, facilitated by long distance electrical energy transfer, needs the automobile as a corresponding means for the transportation of people to locations that are distant from each other and at different altitudes, corresponding to the road rather than the railway.
Very Marxist, right? In a sense, a kind of materialist Marxist, at least echo.
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
way that the mode of production, the mode of energy, etc., is driving or travels along a similar trajectory as the cultural. Goes back to the, I mean, the example of, man, my mind is exploding here, but I kind of see the metaphor between something like the priest or the scribe or monk relative to information and the nuclear power plant or the thermodynamic, like steam power, or like, right? Because that's relying on heat, like a big furnace, let's say, just to simplify the visual example, right? You can't really move that. That's not as mobile as the gasoline, right? The gasoline enables you to really to move that thermodynamic process in a much more distributed manner. So I don't know. There's just something kind of interesting in the way that really it's like the infrastructure of maybe even something like evolution itself or creativity or development, something like that. I don't know necessarily how to say it definitively, but it's like that infrastructure of flow and creativity and problems and all that solutions, etc., is all like it kind of maps onto both things, both aspects of development. And there's a certain, like, there's a milieu, there are two different milieus operating between one another. There's like humans are kind of this weird thing that allows the two milieus of inorganic and organic matter and energy to flow together, right?
Yeah, and I think that,
Which would go to Marx and desiring machines and all that shit too.
I thought you were going to swerve back to Dune and say like spice production being making possible the interstellar travel, and how that bottleneck on Arrakis is precisely. I mean, that without thinking about that use of spice, the whole political intrigue doesn't quite make sense.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That crux of what is possible automotively, even if spice isn't an energy source like electricity or fossil fuels or whatnot, although that could be debated at least on the human level, right? You know, in the different ways that it interacts with them. But you know, on the analogy at least is loosely, following.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Do we want to say anything else? I mean, I feel like so many of this stuff we'll be able to come back to. I just wondered if you had another cool moment that we could discuss before winding down.
I mean, maybe the one that I would finish up on perhaps would be like he uses this example, and you brought this to mind too whenever you referenced Laruelle participating in something with the publication of Simondon's work.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting because I was thinking like this example that Simondon uses about the way that, and this goes to Deleuze and Guattari as well, the way that the bridge, for example, would only comes into existence or efficacy or something like that. Maybe you can help me with this. Whenever the keystone is placed, the bridge crystallizes at that moment. In the last instance, sort of, I don't know. Maybe I'm talking out of my ass here. You can you can chastise me if you want, but I don't know.
No.
To me, that is such a great example of how, and two, like the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about fascism, right? It's like it's dispersed in all these little shards throughout the social, but then once you reach a certain like
super saturation, right?
Threshold, right? Like the crystal, even,
once it crystallizes out, yeah,
exactly. So it's that same kind of in the last instance moment. It's like there's always these potentials sitting out there, just waiting to coalesce around a particular formation or what have you. But it's not, and it's so it's determined in a sense, but not until that very last moment, which I think is just such a
these
super interesting.
These are good. First, I want to point out that the conditioning of the present by the future was what I had in mind when I was talking about the technical object produces its own conditions of possibility. There's a transcendental argument going on here, and so when he says, "What is at stake here is a conditioning of the present by the future by that which is not yet," he's talking about invention, and I think that's really cool. But to go to your one about the example he gives, like an arch that is stable only once it is finished, this object that fulfills a function of relation maintains itself and is coherent once it exists, and because it exists, it creates its own associated milieu from itself and is really individualized in it. Obviously, that ties into the point about conditioning of the present by the future, but it is interesting. Yeah, this notion of, as I called it, bootstrapping, but I think that's probably not very fair. He says that invention is possible because the living being, and he's thinking about the human, but obviously it could apply to other living beings, carries its associated milieu with it. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about that. It's because we carry our associated milieu with us as biological beings that there can be a kind of mapping of mental schemas and technical schemas to the point of finding an internal resonance, as you might call it, finding the disparity and using that as the engine for novelty.
That also even points a little bit towards something like matter and memory relative to like the milieu, carrying the milieu with us, right? The memory, the knowledge goes back, even that goes back to the encyclopedia example too, right?
Yes.
We carry that knowledge with us, and it's in a certain way, like it's non-physical, right? It is pure ideal in a sense, but obviously supplemented by something physical. But even now, like, I don't know what is electric, like a computer is something that kind of is cutting across two different milieus as well, right?
Let's see. I just want to read a little bit of this. The reason the living being can invent is because it is an individual being that carries its associated milieu with it. This capacity for conditioning itself lies at the root of the capacity to produce objects that condition themselves. What has escaped the attention of psychologists in their analysis of the inventive imagination aren't the schemas, forms, or operations that stand out as the spontaneously salient and striking elements, but rather the dynamic ground upon which these schemas confront each other and combine and wherein they participate. Gestalt psychology, while recognizing the function of totalities, attributed force to form. A deeper analysis of the inventive process would no doubt show that what is determinate and plays an energetic role are not forms, but that which carries the forms, which is to say their ground. The ground, while perpetually marginal with respect to attention, is what harbors the dynamisms, is that through which the system of forms exists, yada, yada, yada. And then he says, I put an exclamation point next to it. For the ground is the system of virtualities, of potentials, forces that carve out their path, whereas forms are the system of actuality. That is about as Deleuzian as we could
right?
we could get. And before Deleuze, I mean, this is 58. So you could see, obviously, Deleuze doesn't get straight from Simondon, this language of virtual. This is much more, but I think that they both get it from Bergson, which is why it was good you brought up.
Okay, interesting.
matter and memory.
That makes sense. This should also have me thinking about, or maybe I don't even know if this was connected, but I was having this idea about like fractal metabolic processes in the context of like a monism, like maybe a Leibnizian type monadism, where there's like the universe is just a series of like nested metabolisms within, you know what I mean? Which goes to milieu in a way, and then there are bridges between milieus, whether it be the example of like maybe the wasp and the orchid and the spider and its web, etc. Right? Like that process. I don't know. That's maybe the direction I was thinking in, that I thought was quite fascinating, but not. I mean, just really kind of like obviously taking a little bit of somewhat of a leap from what Simondon is really writing about here. But
no, I think that the recurrent causality, or
yes, there you go.
I think this is what you were thinking of when Simondon he keeps repeating this notion of a recurrent causality. This is what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah,
like your notion of the keystone and the bridge, or the arc,
right?
Or the arch, as Simondon has it, or I mean that recurrent causality is, I think, his language for this way in which there is a transcendental element. And I know he doesn't use that language. I'm just thinking about I think how Deleuze wants to see it, because in Logic of Sense he says that Simondon comes up with a new conception of the transcendental, and he wants to He wants to give him credit for that based on this new thinking of individuation, specifically pre-individual singularities, etc. But we can already see it here in this book on Technics, and recurrent causality, I think, is one that is really that's the one that I've been trying to pay most attention to, because he doesn't quite really discuss it all that much in Ilfie. I don't even know if he has that term. I'll check. I'll do a Control F search through there, but I don't even know if he. Off the top of my head, it's possible, but it's definitely not as important, or it's not as nuanced. And so it's interesting that he's not merely rehashing some of his stuff from the primary dissertation in this one. It's got its own legs to stand on, and that shows how he is a philosopher. I mean, he's making new concepts. I was thinking for next week, do you want to do some more 1,000 Plateaus? I was thinking we could do the third plateau, where actually we get to discuss more about the annexed milieu. I mean, they go straight into it.
Does metallurgy get brought up?
Now, metallurgy is going to be discussed.
That's later on, okay? Because I was thinking he does bring up metallurgy.
They cite Simondon in the part you're talking about. I believe it's on nomadology that they talk about.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Let me look and just see. I think that they quote Simondon on 408 to 410. So yes, nomadology, and they cite him. They say certain distinctions proposed by Simondon can be compared to those of Husserl, and they go into the hylomorphic model. They go into singularities, hexaides, variable intensive affects, the machinic phylum. I know that's stuff that you're interested in. So we'll definitely see. We'll definitely be able to get to that. But I do think that this you will like. I think you will like this third plateau. It's quite wacky, and you can see I've already marked it up a bunch, and I'm going to do it again. But I think it's about 50 pages, so probably even less than we read. Let's see, it's from page 40 to page 74. So 34 pages.
Sounds 34. Good. I can definitely manage that in my diminished mental
capacity. Well, brother,
first let's I'll close this out and just say this will wrap up another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour, and we'll see you all next week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity. including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.